They were never charged, yet they were shot. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this testimony. Ordinary people driving to church, going to work, heading to a medical appointment, ended up with bullets in their bodies and guns pointed at their faces without a single criminal charge to justify it. This isn't about border crossings or violent standoffs. It's about what happens when armed federal power meets everyday life and the rules quietly change. And here's why this matters to you. None of these people expected to be in danger that morning. They were not resisting arrest. They were not fleeing a crime. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment under a system that no longer needed a conviction before pulling the trigger. Listen closely to what they describe. Stopped cars, shattered windows, pepper balls, live rounds, blood pooling on the floor of a mechanic's shop. Then notice what comes next, after the sirens fade and the cameras turn off. Because the most disturbing part of this story doesn't happen on the street. What happened next wasn't treated as an emergency. It was treated as routine. The testimony lays out the event, but only partially at first. A Border Patrol vehicle stops just 1 or 2 car lengths ahead. Agents jump out. Guns come up, no warning signs, no clear instructions. In Chicago and Minneapolis, on ordinary streets, this wasn't a raid or a chase. It was traffic. And then suddenly it wasn't. One witness says time seemed to stop. Another says they recognized the danger not from training, but from watching previous encounters on the news. That detail matters. It suggests this wasn't unpredictable. It followed a pattern people were already learning to fear. Federal vehicles, armed agents, confusion, escalation. Here's the key framing shift. These incidents are not presented as isolated mistakes. They line up across cities, across weeks, across different victims who share one thing in common. None of them were charged with crimes, yet force was used first, explanations came later, and accountability never arrived. So ask yourself this question. If this can happen during a drive to church or a medical appointment, what exactly is the threshold now for lethal force? Because once you see the pattern, the next detail hits much harder. The claim at the center of this hearing is simple and severe. Force was used where no crime existed, and the evidence comes straight from the victim's own words. One woman describes a Border Patrol vehicle stopping just ahead of her car. She says agents jumped out and pointed a gun at her. She didn't hear an arrest order. She didn't hear her rights. She heard danger. She says she knew from watching earlier news coverage of similar encounters in Chicago that she was at risk. Then comes the detail that locks this in. She describes pepper balls hitting her arms and legs. She describes live rounds shattering her back passenger window. She says she felt bullets continue to pierce her body as she tried to drive to safety. Later in hospital, she counted 7 bullet holes. 7. Here's what that means. This wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't a single mistake. It was sustained fire against someone who was driving away, trying not to lose consciousness, trying not to crash into other cars. Now notice what's missing from every part of that account. There is no charge, no arrest explanation, no crime described, and that absence is not an accident, because once you see what happens after the shooting, the story escalates fast. What follows shows how quickly something extreme becomes normal. After the shooting, the expectation would be stabilization, medical care, restraint. Instead, the testimony describes armed agents standing over a bleeding woman in hospital, watching her wounds being treated, then rushing the nurses to finish. Less than 3 hours after arriving, she says she was discharged and taken into federal custody, still dizzy, still bleeding, still wrapped in bandages. That detail matters because it echoes something older and more troubling. Not a single historical lecture, just a pattern. When force is justified first, procedure adapts around it. Care becomes secondary. Speed becomes the priority. And what should be unthinkable starts to feel routine. Listen to the language used next. She wasn't described as a victim. She was labeled a domestic terrorist. The claim was that she had rammed federal agents with her vehicle. But here's the escalation point. The vehicle itself, the key piece of evidence, was driven across the country by an agent from Chicago to Maine, removing it from the case entirely. That's not chaos. That's control. And once the charges quietly disappear, the meaning of that removal becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the contradiction becomes undeniable. Federal prosecutors initially claimed she had rammed their vehicle. That was the justification for gunfire. But then the actions stopped matching the words. The agent who jumped out of the car that day didn't leave the vehicle in Chicago. He drove it across the country all the way to Maine, removing the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. The car she was accused of trying to ram simply disappeared from scrutiny. Then something else happened. The charges were dropped. Not reduced, not amended, dropped entirely. And that decision carries weight. Because if there had been damage to that car, if there had been proof of an attempted ramming, those charges would not have vanished. By dropping them, the prosecution quietly conceded something they never said out loud. Here's the line that changes how you see this. A 30-year-old Montessori school teacher was shot multiple times, called a domestic terrorist, dragged from a hospital, held in federal detention, and never charged with a crime. Not before, not after. And she wasn't alone. None of the victims testifying that day were ever charged, which raises a more disturbing question. If charges aren't required, what actually triggers this level of force now? Then the story speeds up and control starts slipping. Another witness takes the stand, an American citizen from Minneapolis, disabled, autistic, living with a traumatic brain injury. On the day in question, he wasn't fleeing anything. He was driving to his 39th appointment at a county brain injury center. That's the setting. Traffic. ICE vehicles blocking an intersection. No signs, no clear way through. An agent yells an order. Then another agent yells something different. Conflicting instructions, shouted threats, all at once. He rolls down his window. The passenger side glass explodes across his face. Hands grab at him. He shouts that he's disabled. The response, he says, was 2 words: too late. Here's the second hit. He sees a combat knife pulled in front of his face. He thinks it's for him. Later, he learns it was used to cut his seatbelt. He's dragged out, slammed face first into the ground, pressure on his back, cuffed arms and legs, carried through the street while yelling that he has a brain injury. And here's the third. He was never asked for ID, never told he was under arrest, never read his rights, never charged with a crime, different city, different agents, same outcome. What happens if this continues? Now shift it to yourself, because this is where the distance disappears. Imagine you're late for work, or on your way to a doctor's appointment, or stuck in traffic with no signs, no instructions, and armed vehicles blocking the road. You don't need to be undocumented. You don't need to be a suspect. In these testimonies, citizenship didn't protect anyone. Disability didn't slow anything down. Compliance didn't guarantee safety. One woman describes trying not to pass out behind the wheel because she was worried about other drivers. Another man says he can no longer lift his arms normally after being forced to the ground. These aren't political outcomes. They're physical ones. Pain, fear, long-term injury, and the shock of realizing the system you rely on doesn't see you as a person in that moment. And notice what's consistent. After the force, there's silence, no charges, no explanation, no apology. Life just resumes, except for the people whose bodies don't. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because the question isn't whether this happened. It's why it keeps happening without consequences. And that takes us beyond individual agents to something much bigger. What allows this to happen isn't chaos, it's alignment. When incentives reward force before restraint, everything downstream adjusts. Agents are trained to dominate situations quickly. Prosecutors inherit cases after damage is already done. Institutions close ranks, not because every action was correct, but because admitting failure would expose the whole structure. Spectacle replaces scrutiny. Fear replaces judgment. Look at the mechanism closely. The language used is broad: threat, resistance, officer safety. Those words appear early, long before evidence is tested. Once they're spoken, the burden quietly shifts. The injured person must now prove they didn't deserve what happened. And when charges are dropped later, that moment passes without headlines, without correction, without consequence. This is why these stories don't stay isolated. They don't need coordination. They only need permission. Permission to escalate, permission to act first, permission to let the system absorb the fallout. Here's the unsettling insight mainstream coverage rarely touches. Accountability doesn't fail loudly. It fades quietly, case by case, until extreme outcomes feel procedural. And once a system learns it can survive this kind of damage, the next move becomes easier to predict, because momentum doesn't stop on its own. From here, the trajectory splits, but neither path brings comfort. On one path, nothing visibly changes. Hearings conclude, testimony is archived, agents remain in service, prosecutors move on. The system absorbs the shock exactly as it was designed to. In that future, the next encounter looks familiar: a stopped car, confusion, force justified in the moment, reviewed later, quietly dissolved when scrutiny fades. momentum carries forward because there's no friction strong enough to stop it. On the other path, pressure builds, not all at once, but unevenly. More footage surfaces, more testimony stacks up, patterns become harder to dismiss as coincidence. The contradiction grows louder. No charges, yet extreme force. And at some point, someone with authority has to decide whether protecting the system matters more than confronting what it's become. But here's the detail that matters most. Both paths are already forming at the same time. Silence pushes one forward. Attention strengthens the other. And neither waits for permission from the people caught in between. The next move won't come from a speech or a policy memo. It will come from how often this pattern is allowed to repeat before it's no longer deniable. And that brings us to the part that reframes everything you've just heard. Here's the insight that stays with you long after the footage ends. These testimonies aren't really about individual agents or even individual decisions. They're about a system that no longer requires a crime to justify force, only a moment of perceived control. Once that line is crossed, everything else becomes optional. Charges, evidence, accountability, even care. In one sentence, this story is simple and unsettling. When force comes first, truth arrives too late to matter. That's why these cases don't resolve cleanly. Dropped charges don't undo bullet wounds. Release from custody doesn't erase trauma. And hearings don't reverse the quiet lesson being learned on the street. The loop forward is already open. More encounters, more testimony, more moments where the explanation comes after the damage. And the question isn't whether this will happen again. It's who will be next and whether anyone will still be listening when they speak. If you want to follow where this goes and what the next layer reveals, stay with this channel. The deeper pattern is still unfolding, and this story isn't finished yet.